Need help? Call our cybersecurity team and book a consultation with us today.
Thank you, everyone, for joining today. I definitely appreciate you taking the time to join us. I'm joined also by Shusia. She's from AWS, and she'll be going through the part of the well-architected framework. And my name's Jason Bomar. I'm with LA Networks. As I mentioned, Shusia will be going over the actual well-architected review. And then after that, I'll go through a case study for a project that we did for a customer involving edge security, which is security is one of the pillars. And then we'll end with a hands-on lab. Reshma Mohammed will be taking us through that lab. Can we go to the next slide, please? So just a brief word on LA Networks, if you're not familiar with us. We've been in business for over 20 years, and we're headquartered here in Los Angeles, although we do work on a national and global scale. Our organization's a little bit different than a lot of organizations in that we're over 70% engineers. We started out as a Cisco partner, and so a lot of our engineering expertise and focus is on advanced networking, but we also do automation, cloud-based security, on-prem security, etc. And a lot of our engagements are either repeat customers or referrals, which I think speaks well to our track record. Next slide, please. And we have kind of 5 pillars ourselves that we focus on, and that's managed services, security and surveillance, data center and cloud, networking and wireless, and collaboration. We have multiple partners that we team up with. Obviously, we'll be focusing on AWS today. We also do a lot of Cisco, Fortinet, Aruba, Palo Alto, among others. And that's just a little bit of an overview. For housekeeping, if you do have questions, please feel free to pop those into the Q&A. I'll try to keep an eye on chat, but we have multiple eyes on the Q&A, so you'll probably get answered in a more timely manner. And you can also raise your hand if you have a question, and I'll do my best to reach out to you, or if you're having some kind of technical difficulty. The slides and the recording will be available. I put my contact information in the chat. You can send me an email if you would like. Otherwise, once everything's ready, I will send out a link to it. And I think with that said, I think we're ready to start the well-architected side of things. Shusia, thank you.
Thank you, Jason. Hello, everybody. My name is Susia Luquido. I am a partner solution architect with AWS, and today I want to go over what type of framework that we have in place to find out whether or not you are well architected. So I like to start with this question, which is, like when you look at the workloads that your team is building, can you actually answer, are you well architected? How confident are you? And I hope that, most of you or all of you will be able to confidently say yes. But we do have this framework in place to help you answer that question. So before we get into it, I'd like to look at the brief history, and I'm not going to go over every single milestone in this history. I want to highlight the fact that even though the concept of well-architected started in 2012, we published the framework in 2015. So at that time, we have questions across the 4 pillars, which is security, reliability, performance, and cost. And then since then, we added operational excellence in 2016. And then we realized that sometimes some of our customers and partners wants to have a self-service option. So we launched the self-service AWS Well-Architected Tool in 2018. And then the most recent addition, which was announced in reInvent 2021, is the sixth pillar that we added on sustainability. So let's talk about why would you want to apply the well-architected framework. So one reason is by reducing, firefighting, capacity management, and then by using automation, you can easily experiment and then you can release value more often. Another reason is when you understand where you have risks in your architecture, and then you can address them before it has impact on your business and create distraction on your team, then you could really lower or mitigate those risks. And then you also it will ensure that you have made the active architectural decision that would highlight how they might impact your business outcomes. And last but not least, it will make sure that your teams are aware of best practices that we have learned through reviewing thousands of customer architecture on AWS. And we have seen customers use our well-architected framework to successfully achieve all of these. So well-architected is the mechanism that helps you be successful in your cloud journey. Helps you learn the strategies and best practices for architecting in the cloud, and it helps you measure your architecture against best practices and then improve your architecture by addressing any issues. So what is it? So it is a framework that provides a set of questions and design principles across 6 pillars. And then to fully evaluate your workloads and industry scenarios, you could use applicable lenses from well-architected framework along with the management and governance lens. So these lenses extend the guidance offered by AWS to a specific industry and technology domain. So the examples here are machine learning, analytics, serverless, HPC, IoT, and so on. And in terms of industry, you could see there's a financial services lens. So in 2021, we released the custom lens feature because a lot of our customer has requested this feature so they can create their own custom lenses that is specific to their needs and environments. So let's go over the overview of this framework. So you can see the 6 pillars here, but creating a technology solution is really a lot like building like a physical building. And I like to think of it when you build a house, if the foundation is not solid, you might actually run into structural problem, and then that would undermine the integrity and the function of the building. And similarly, when you're building solutions in the cloud, if you neglect the 6 pillars of these, there's operational excellence, there's security, reliability, performance efficiency, cost optimization, and sustainability. So if you ignore these, it can become a challenge to build a system that delivers functional requirements and meet your expectation. But when you incorporate these pillars, then it will help you produce a stable and efficient system and allow you to focus on functional requirements. So design principles, it will help you adopt the appropriate mental model when building cloud and ensure that you take advantage of the capabilities of AWS, and that would free yourself from the constraint of traditional approaches. So I'd like to get a little bit deeper into the general design principles. So cloud computing really has opened up the technology space to a whole new world of thinking where constraints that we used to have in the traditional environment no longer exist. So when thinking about general design principle, it's interesting to contrast with how you think about this in a traditional environment. So for example, in on-prem, you have to guess how much infrastructure you would need, and then it often based on a very high level business requirement and demand, and then often before even a line of code is written. And then secondly, on-prem is difficult to afford to test at scale because a complete duplicate of production costs is really hard to justify, especially with low utilization. So often you might wait into production, and then once you're there, you normally would find a whole new class of issues at a high scale. And then any proof of concept or architectural experimentation usually is done by hand, and usually only done at the start of the project. And then you generally had a static architecture, and it's difficult to think about making the change when you are doing this on-prem. And also on-prem is usually not very easy to generate data sets that would allow you to make informed decision. So you probably would end up using models and assumption to size your architecture. And then last but not least, in a traditional environment, you would only exercise your runbook when something happened in production versus on the cloud. You could improve through game days where you simulate a real world problems. So if the cloud constraints have been removed, you can use these principles to take advantage of that. So let's talk about performing a well-architected framework review. So firstly, the intent of the review is to improve outcomes. It is not an audit, so so we want to get that out of people's mind that it's not an audit. It's about a team working out how to improve, and it's pragmatic. We look at advice that we see that actually help people, and then once you have reviewed a workload, you should continually iterate on it and use the milestones to see how it's improving over time. And we have seen teams use the review outcome to explain their business, to explain to their business the value that they're adding. So what do we learn from doing a review? So first, we review early in the life cycle. It's quicker and easy to fix things. And then it could also influence design decision. And then people don't usually intentionally make bad decisions. What we notice is that people might neglect decision. Like for example, they don't decide not to back up data, but often they forget to talk about it. And then most workloads that have high risk that need to be addressed, and when you and the fact that you find those is not necessarily a bad thing because they're always there. And if you address them, then it's one last thing that can damage or slow down your business. So it's about improvement. Do not be afraid to find high-risk items. It's actually good that you find them before it becomes a problem. So why should you perform the review? So first and foremost, if you and your team ever ask, how should we do this in the cloud, or how are others are doing this in the cloud, or even what would AWS recommend, how we approach this, then the review would help you answer these questions. So the well-architected framework contains a set of best practices that AWS has developed through decades of designing and operating workloads with our customers. And the framework will expose these best practices to anyone that is searching for them. Customers also use the framework as a way to define the best practices and standards that they lay out for their technology and for the teams to adopt. And using the tool, teams can measure their workloads against predefined governance standard. And then with the well-architected framework used across your technology portfolio, you can get an aggregate view of how your teams are maturing and where there might be consistent areas that will need improvement across organization and teams. So what is a workload? So a workload is not just made up of technology components. It is also made up of the people and processes. There are key concepts that you want to be aware of when you start thinking well-architected in AWS. So first, workloads is the people and teams and processes and runbooks and technology and infrastructure that deliver business value to a customer. And the other concept is about a sponsor. So workload sponsor is the person in the company who's ultimately responsible for the success of the workload to the company, to the board or shareholder. And they are usually the one that has funding and headcount authority. And the pillar sponsor is usually a subject matter expert for a pillar or for a lens that can answer question and own risk mitigation for that particular pillars or lens. So these are some key concepts that you would want to keep in mind. And there are 3 phases to the review. First is prepare. This is where you would define the workload and identify the sponsor, and then agree on review strategy and schedule. And preparation is a key because understanding the extent or boundary on impact on other workload will be key to the success. And then the next phase is review. This is where you would run the review using a well-architecting tool, and context is really the priority here. And then guide is about reviewing the report and improvement plan. So this is where you would prioritize to turn risk into solution and invest in improvements, and then create some actionable steps to move forward. So there are different ways you can run the review. First, you could do a self-service. So this is usually more for learning, and it's also good for planning. Just get yourself familiar to using the well-architected tool. And when you run it on this mode, you should be working on it as non-production. Or you could do self-service as a team. So when you do this, you want to pick a good representation of the different stakeholder. So this will require a little bit more time and commitment, but it's also good for team learning. Another way of running the review, you could run it with AWS-led review. And this is best for critical workloads and for deeper insight and expertise. Or you could run it with as a partner-led review. So for example, you can have LA Networks run this well-architected review for you. There will be some credits that Jason or Resma would go over later for resolving the high-risk issues that come out of that. Those are the risks that got identified that you can remediate. And it's good for deeper insight and expertise. And also partner, like LA Networks will be there for you every step of the way. They can be very hands-on and supporting you and making sure that your environment is well architected, and they have the expertise for that. So the process is a virtuous cycle. By running review on one workload, the teams often will learn and then get empowered to run reviews with other teams on their workload. and also share the lesson learns. And the lesson learned from the workload review can often be used to improve others through shared AWS organizational changes or shared architectural pattern. So what is available in the well-architected framework? So first, the content, which is the framework itself. We spend some time looking at the different pillars and design principle and so on. And then there's the tool, which Resma will be demoing to you shortly. It contains a series of questions that you can run through in different format that we just talked about, whether that's a self-run review or through the partner or AWS. And then there's the data itself, which is the information that you have from doing reviews. And then if you go to the website contains the whole framework. So it's pretty easy to link to a particular section. You can access the map by clicking on the logo. And then from the map, you can pretty much jump to any section. The website is pretty well structured and has all the information you need to understand the well-architected framework. And of course, LA Networks and TDSNX would be there to support you whenever you have questions. And then we have pretty comprehensive, well-architected labs. We do have the environment set up for you to run the labs today. We will, if you go through this workshop site, you will notice there are so many different labs that you can run through, and it covers pretty much every pillars that we have within well-architected framework. And it is open source in GitHub, so we are open to any improvement you might have once you have the opportunity to run through these labs. And finally, we also have the solution library, which is useful for finding any pre-built solution or service pattern that help you get started. And these have been vetted by AWS. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Jason, who will go over some case studies.
Sure. Thank you, Susia. So this is kind of a more deep dive on the security side of things, and I just thought I'd walk through what a solution might look like with one of these. This didn't necessarily come directly from a well-architected review, but it came through a company that is a customer of ours that we were working with, and they've done multiple of these reviews, and then they just had a kind of an edge case security need where they wanted to find a way to build out inspection for inbound and outbound internet access in their VPCs. So the solution components for this were obviously just VPCs. I simplified this and generalized it down quite a bit, but we have obviously subnet objects within these VPCs. I kept it here just public, private, and then something called the gateway load balancer endpoint, which is just a private endpoint service that you might use. And that's how we're getting our traffic to and from the inspection VPC. And then each VPC kind of gets its own routing table. So this solution is very flexible and allows for kind of maximum inspection capability. You can get microsegmentation through this. It comes, though, at the cost of you do have some routing complexity that comes with it. There's another version of this we've done which simplifies the routing and instead uses a transit gateway or a TGW. You don't get the microsegmentation, but it simplifies the routing design. And you can really go either way. It really depends on what problems you're trying to solve. And then we use a special kind of routing table called an ingress routing table. Some of you may have heard of these, some may not. It's a way to kind of work around the normal order of operations on route decisions within a VPC. The ingress routing table is important because it allows you to intercept traffic before the intrinsic router necessarily sees it and direct input. And then we have something called a gateway load balancer and the associated endpoint. And that's going to be load balancing our traffic to our security appliances. In this case, we used Fortinet or FortiGate firewalls. It would work with any vendor's firewalls, really. It just happened to be, in this case, it was FortiGate's. And then the endpoints, as I mentioned earlier, go up in the VPC. But we'll take a look at what it actually kind of look like. Next slide, please. So there's really two different traffic flows, ingress and egress. We'll take the egress flow first. That's the simpler of the two. Neither is terribly complex, but as I mentioned, the firewalls here are FortiGates. You see those kind of towards the bottom of the diagram, but it could really be any vendor. One thing that's kind of nice with the gateway load balancer solution is that these firewalls are active-active because the gateway load balancer itself is session or state aware. And so you can easily spin up additional firewalls. And if you have load that requires it or something like that, if it's a busy, time for you or something like that, you can spin these up automatically. You can put them in an auto scale group, however you want to do it. And the load balancer is state and session aware. So it knows that if it's already got session established through one of the firewalls, continue sending it to that same firewall. And if it's a net new session, go ahead and take the next available in a round robin, I believe. By default, this solution will keep everything in a single AZ. You're going to want to probably disable that and instead go cross AZ. That enables kind of a more robust HA mechanism. And the way that the traffic kind of flows is, let's say I have a private host and he's trying to go out to the internet. The use case I always use is patching because I try to think of security things and I want to patch all my servers. So when he goes out to the public internet to get his patches, he does not route through his IGW in the VPC. Instead, his default route sends him up to that gateway load balancer endpoint. The gateway load balancer endpoint actually establishes a secure private tunnel down to the inspection VPC, particularly to the gateway load balancer itself. The gateway load balancer then forwards it on to the UTM or the FortiGate or the firewall, whatever vendor again that you want to use for inspection, assuming that it passes inspection. So I say, okay, I'm coming from the private subnet. I'm going out to my patching service. That sounds fine. I'm going to allow it. It forwards it on. It does the NAT down on the firewall itself. There's a couple of ways that you could address the NAT. It depends a little bit on your own use cases. And then because it's been natted to the firewall, it'll come back through that same IGW, which is good because you want to preserve state anytime firewalls are involved. It comes back up, goes back up through the gateway load balancer to the endpoint to the subnet. And that's how the egress traffic kind of works. Next slide. Ingress is actually pretty similar, but there's a slight difference. It's a little trickier. Ingress, we will use the IGW that's in the local VPC, right? And this is where that ingress routing table comes in. So the example I always give is I have a web server that's in a public subnet, and someone on the internet wants to browse to my web server, right? That makes sense. So they're going to do so by coming in through the local IGW. It does not forward directly to the web server. Instead, that ingress routing table kind of intercepts it, and it says, if you're coming from the public, but you're trying to go to anything really, I need you to first forward over to that gateway load balancer endpoint again. And here's where it gets pretty similar to our previous one. The load balancer endpoint forwards it on in a encapsulated private tunnel down to the gateway load balancer, which sends it over to the UTM for inspection. If the UTM permits the traffic, it says, okay, you're coming in on port 443. You're going to a known web server. I have a rule for that. You're good. It sends it back up and it goes directly to the public web server. Obviously, if the firewall doesn't like the traffic for any reason, it can obviously deny the traffic, right? So the reason that you do this is if you have multiple VPCs, you can keep the NATs up local to the VPC in the app itself, as opposed to trying to get fancy with doing a lot of natting down in the centralized VPC. But there's a lot of different ways you could do this. This was just one way that we kind of dealt with this. Like I said, we did a similar one to this, a variation on this that used the transit gateway. The routing's a little simpler, but you do not get the microsegmentation where I can intercept traffic, say, between public and private, or between any subnets within the VPC. To be honest, any two subnets communicating, we can force them to communicate through the inspection VPC. You tend to lose that capability if you go with the TGW. So it really just depends on the use case and the problem that you're trying to solve. I will also mention that regardless of whether you're using Fortinet or Cisco or Palo Alto or some other firewall, you need to work with your security appliance vendor to make sure you understand their integration with the solution. If it's with the gateway load balancer, kind of like as we have depicted here, they need to be able to support what we call Geneve tunnel encapsulation and decapsulation. That's an important step for the gateway load balancer because that's what the tunnel is that's coming down from the endpoints. And if it's not, if you're not using the load balancer, instead you're using maybe the TGW or something like that, you still want to work with them to make sure that you understand how they deploy into a cloud. A lot of them, if they have the gateway load balancer, will go active-active, but they may go active-passive if you use like a TGW or something like that. There's a whole list of items you need to kind of be aware of. LA Networks can definitely help out with those sorts of things. We've guided several accounts through this kind of process. I particularly focus mostly on networking and security. You can probably tell since I've got a solution here that has lots of routing tables and lots of inspection going on. So, but if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out. As we kind of mentioned earlier towards the top, if you would like to go through a well-architected review, we do have some funds available to help with some of the remediation on those. You can reach out to me. I put my email in the chat, but I'll put it in again in a moment, just in case we had anyone who joined a little bit late. If you reach out, we can talk and I can get you the terms sent over so you can understand how that program works. Any questions? You can put them in the Q&A. In the meantime, could we go to the next slide, please? Yep. I think we're ready to start the lab, which I think Rashma is going to take over that portion of it.
Yes, absolutely, Jason. Are you all able to hear me?
Yeah,
Yes.
I think so.
Okay, great. So let me put the link for the lab to access the lab. I've just posted a link in the chat, dashboard.event-engine, that would provision the lab resources for you, so you have the environment up and running for you for the next 12 hours. So anyone who wants to go through the well-architected lab, also the lab guide, I've just posted it a little ahead in the chat. I am again reposting it for everyone. So you can access the labs using the event engine, and the lab guide. I've posted a link for the lab guide here. So let me share my screen. Are you able to see my event engine?
Yes.
Okay, so if you click on the link that I just posted for the event engine, you should be able to see a page similar to the one that I'm just showing. The event hash, Shusia, is it possible once again to repost the event hash in the chat?
Let me find the chat window.
Or you can even put the hash using, what is displayed on the screen. Once you key in the event hash and accept the terms, have you been able to put the hash in the chat, Shisa?
Yes, it should be on the chat right now. Can everybody see it?
If someone could give a hands up. Okay, thank you, Tad. Thank you for that. So accept the terms and conditions. I have already previously logged into this, so it's bringing me to this page. Or usually it would take you to a page which would show you, which would ask you to either choose between a one-time password, an Amazon login, or an Amazon employee login. It's usually best, one of the easiest ways would be to just get that one-time password generated. It would ask you for the email address to which you want the one-time password to be sent. Key in the email to which you want to get your one-time password, and you should be able to get that one-time password in 3-4 minutes after you key in the details. If I could get some participation from the attendees, if you are able to log in, it would be great. We can get started off. Have you been able to get into the lab environment? Anyone? Or if you're facing any difficulties, please let us know.
I think so far I only have one person able to log in. Does everybody else need help?
I see a thumbs up.
Oh, I have another one. Okay, coming in.
So once you are into the lab environment, or you've come to this particular window, you click on the AWS console. Once again, it would open this window. Which would take you to the console. Once you're in the console, can at least someone give me a thumbs up if you're able to get into the console?
I see 3 people in the console now.
Anyone else having any difficulties? Please let us know in the chat, or you can come off mute and share any difficulties that you're facing as well?
We have 5 now.
Okay, great. So once you're in the console, we can search for the well-architected tool here, the very first one. And what you would do is define the workload. I already have a couple of test sessions that I've done. We will go to define workload. And today, I mean, the workload that you want to essentially, I mean, in enterprise environment, it is one of the best practices to separate the workloads, the test, dev, and prod environments, or even separate the workloads by departments. And I mean, since we want to follow the best practices of giving least privilege to the users or the user groups, and the well-architected review could be done for any one of the accounts or a few of the accounts that you could have in your entire environment. So this would be your identifier for the particular workloads for which you are doing this well-architected review. So in my case, I'm just going to be putting it as AWS test. You can add a description in here. I am going to be doing it as test for well-architected review. Review owner, just keying in my name. For us, it's pre-production workloads, so just choose between the production and pre-production. Now, if you have multiple account setups and you are operating from multiple regions, you can choose all the regions that would be applicable for you. I am just going with the Oregon region over here. And you can exclude regions as well that you want to exclude. For example, if you're not having anything in Asia Pacific or regions like that, you can always exclude the AWS regions that you do not want to have the well-architected review done. Again, optional, we could mention the account IDs associated with the regions for which we are doing the well-architected review. Any architectural designs that you already have, we can upload it into S3, the simple storage, and then provide the links, generate and provide the links over here. Industry type, whichever is applicable for you, you could choose it over here, which is again optional. So we go to next over here and choose, I mean, as Shusi had earlier mentioned, we'll choose the well-architected framework lens. The FDR lens are applicable for ISVs, serverless lens is for serverless workloads, SaaS is for SaaS workloads. Let's go ahead with the well-architected framework and click on reviewing. I mean, what you can see over here is just that we are starting the review. It's just an overview of what we're doing. So start reviewing AWS Well-Architected Framework. As you can see over here, all the 6 pillars are mentioned, and each one of these pillars have questions, which while we are doing a well-architected review with you, we would go through your environment to see if under each question that we have, if each one of those satisfies the criteria, and evaluate the risks that are associated with each one of them. So for example, now, since we've spoken so much of security, I am going to be reviewing a couple of questions in the security pillar. For example, going to the first question here under the security pillar. So we are talking about how do we securely operate, how secure are you operating your workload? So as we can see over here, these are the options that we need to choose from based on, again, we will be working alongside with you in determining these. And that's how we come up with the medium risk or the high risk items that needs to be remediated. And as you can see under the helpful resources, there are a bunch of resources, videos, as well as guides that would help you in understanding what are the best practices when it comes to securing your workload. So when we're talking about securing workloads using accounts, as we mentioned earlier, if Ideally, you would want to separate the workloads into different accounts, like it could be dev, test, and production. Your production workloads needs to be the most secure, obviously giving the least privilege access to users within each one of these accounts. And for example, if we were to go by departments in enterprise or even mid-level or a small SMB environment, for example, your finance teams only needs access to your billing console. They do not need access to any other areas, right? So having this account level separation would be good to kind of limit the access and give accesses to different user groups for different purposes. Securing AWS account. Over here, one of the best practices is to have an MFA enabled on your root email address or your root account, your management account that a lot of folks call it as, and that would, and essentially not use your root account, right? For anything else, you would essentially be creating users or user groups and assigning them permissions. That would be one of the best practices, and we would be reviewing that alongside you. So, and as you go through this questionnaire, it's essentially to see if those are applicable in your accounts, and if not, we do not check this box, right? And it might actually flag us later on. And when I show you the report, you can see that it would flag us as a high-risk item. In identifying and validating control objectives. Over here, for example, you are working in secure industries, or your end customers are in secure industries. Whether are you following, for example, in healthcare, are you following the HIPAA compliances that need to be there in place, right? Keeping up with the security threats. We have done multiple assessments, and keeping up with the threats that are there in the market from a security perspective is a key element as well. I would term it as a medium risk, keeping up to date with the security threats, and any recommendations that are there associated with the security threats, keeping abreast of that. That would be helpful for you in keeping your environment secure. And then automating testing and validation of your security controls in the CI/CD pipelines when you're deploying the code. Ensuring the security controls are applied to the machine images and infrastructure as code templates to monitor any security irregularities would be important. Identifying and prioritizing risks. Using any threat model that you want to, and obviously evaluating. It's an ongoing process of evaluating the new security services and features. AWS constantly is releasing features, like for example, AWS Shield that protects you from DDoS attacks, right? It's essential. AWS is always coming up with new security services or features that to help and secure your environment. So keeping abreast of that and implementing those wherever applicable would be a good practice. So as we go through this and see how much of your environment is actually compliant with this, we would choose the options and go with each one of those questions in a similar fashion. Again, I did want to cover this question because it talks about managing identities and giving the right permission sets for people or even for machines. For example, when you're having serverless environments and EC2 needs to access S3, the virtual machine needs to access the storage and retrieve things. How are you going to assign the permissions for it, right? So strong sign-in mechanisms. This is by having an MFA enabled for all the users in your account would really be a very good best practice. Using temporary credentials, so you could use single sign-on mechanisms, or could build a single sign-on with existing identity providers that you might have, which would be, again, for users who do not need to have regular access to your accounts, right? and storing and using your secrets securely. So for encryption of data at rest or in close the door. So for when the data is at rest or in transit, you can store the keys securely in KMS, for example, or AWS Macy helps you detect that confidential information and helps you secure that information, right? Relying on a centralized identity provider, these could be your Active Directory or Okta, or it could be any one of them. And then auditing and rotating the credentials. Like, for example, I mentioned about KMS, right? You can rotate the keys and also with even the IAM users having policies so that they regularly update their passwords every few months would be a good practice to rotate the passwords and securing the account. And leveraging user groups and attributes rather than giving, I mean, it's impossible to create like thousands of users if in an enterprise level of organization. So having groups and associating different permission sets to the groups really helps and makes your job easier essentially. So if we click all of this, we are ensuring that we are compliant with all of these mechanisms that I mentioned. I'll stop here because it could get very tedious to go through each one of this. However, I have generated, once we finish a section or a milestone, we can save it and we are able to download the report that gets generated. I just did a test report before we started our session, which talks to you about all of the security pillars, what are the milestones, how many questions we've answered, what are the high risk items, what are the medium risk items that we have identified during the process or during the assessment. And essentially, as even Jason mentioned, there is funding available where we could do this well-architected review for you for free, and remediations as well. We could get some funding from AWS to do the remediation for a couple of hours. And yeah, so at least 45% of those high risk items that have been identified in here needs to be remediated for us to be eligible to get the funding from AWS for this exercise. So as you mentioned, we could just go under operational excellence, for example, over here you have 7 high-risk items and 2 medium-risk items that have been identified, right? And it further says which were the medium risk items and what is the improvement plan, obviously, which we would work with you for remediation purposes, right? And see to it that your account really follows the best practices, from be it an operational perspective, be it from a cost savings perspective, or from a security standpoint. Any questions? Anyone, any questions? You could very well go through all the questions in here and complete complete the well-architected review. For the remediation purposes, we could very well work with you and do the remediation as well as an assessment. Any questions in the chat?
I don't see any questions in the chat or in the Q&A, Reshma. I think we have several people who did hop into the console, so they may be just going through the tool and getting acquainted with it.
Okay, so for now, I would like to stop. I mean, wanted to show them how all of this works. So over to you, Jason, to conclude.
Sure. Yeah. So thank you. Reshma, and thank you, Shushia as well. I do appreciate everyone taking their time today. I'm going to go ahead and turn off the recording at this point, but I'm going to keep the WebEx up for a little bit. As mentioned a couple of times, we do have, AWS was nice enough to provide some funding for some remediation on these reviews. So if you have an AWS environment and it's not had a well-architected review recently, you should probably reach out and I can get you details on that. If you also just have general questions, I went through one use case with security build out, but we do other use cases as well. If you just like to have a conversation, by all means, again, please reach out. My email is in the chat. It'll also be on the slides when I send it out. Everyone who registered will get a copy of the slides and a link to the recording. I'll leave the WebEx open for a little bit, just in case anyone has questions. I'll probably leave it open for another 15 minutes. If no one has any questions, I'll go ahead and shut it down. I think that's it. I just want to thank everyone for attending and let you know that we do appreciate your time. I know everyone's busy, so thank you.
Need help? Call our cybersecurity team and book a consultation with us today.